In this episode, we are moving from general vulnerability discovery into a more disciplined way of judging whether systems are configured the way they are supposed to be. Security baseline scanning techniques are all about comparing the current condition of a device, server, workstation, network appliance, or application environment to a known secure starting point that the organization has decided to trust. That starting point is called a baseline, and it represents the expected configuration, settings, controls, and behaviors that should be present if the system is being managed responsibly. For a brand new learner, the easiest way to understand the idea is to think of a baseline as the organization's clean reference model for how a system should look before drift, shortcuts, misconfigurations, and bad habits begin to pull it away from that safe condition. Baseline scanning then becomes the practice of checking real systems against that reference so defenders can find where the gaps are, understand what has changed, and decide whether those changes create real security risk. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A security baseline matters because most breaches do not happen only because a brand new unknown flaw appears out of nowhere. Many incidents begin with ordinary weaknesses such as default settings left in place, unnecessary services enabled, weak password rules, excessive permissions, poor logging settings, outdated protocols, or inconsistent hardening across similar systems. A baseline helps an organization define what normal and acceptable security should look like, so that defensive work is not based on guesswork or individual opinion. Without a baseline, one administrator may think a server is configured well, while another sees the same system as dangerously exposed, and those disagreements make it hard to measure security in a consistent way. Once a baseline exists, scanning becomes a way to turn policy and expectation into observable evidence. That is powerful because it gives analysts something concrete to compare against instead of relying on vague impressions about whether a system seems secure enough. Baseline scanning is different from ordinary vulnerability scanning, even though the two are closely related and often support each other. A traditional vulnerability scan is usually focused on identifying known weaknesses such as missing patches, exposed services, outdated software versions, or signs that a system may be susceptible to a known exploit path. A baseline scan, by contrast, is more concerned with whether the system matches the organization's expected secure state, even if no known exploit is directly tied to the difference. For example, a vulnerability scan may highlight a missing update, while a baseline scan may reveal that password complexity rules are weaker than required, audit settings are disabled, screen lock timing is too long, or remote administration is enabled where the baseline says it should not be. Those issues may not always appear dramatic in isolation, yet they often create the conditions that make later attacks easier. For that reason, baseline scanning is an important part of preventing security weakness from becoming normal simply because no immediate breach has happened yet. The concept of a baseline also teaches a deeper lesson about what security work is really measuring. Defenders are not only hunting for obviously broken systems. They are trying to reduce variation in how systems are built, configured, and maintained, because unmanaged variation often creates blind spots, weak controls, and inconsistent behavior across the environment. If two servers are supposed to play the same role, but one has weaker local settings, different logging, extra services, and broader permissions, then the organization has created risk even if both systems are technically functioning. A good baseline gives teams a way to standardize security expectations so that systems doing similar work are protected in similar ways. Baseline scanning then becomes a form of discipline because it helps show where real environments have drifted away from approved design. In large organizations, that drift is almost guaranteed over time, which means baseline scanning is not a one-time cleanup activity, but a recurring practice that helps maintain defensive consistency. A baseline is only useful if it is built from something meaningful, and that is where security expectations usually come from. Organizations often develop baselines from internal policy, regulatory requirements, vendor guidance, hardening recommendations, business risk decisions, and trusted security frameworks that describe safer default settings for common technologies. The exact details vary by environment, but the principle stays the same. The baseline should reflect a thoughtful balance between protection, usability, operational needs, and the role the system plays in the business. A domain controller, a public web server, an employee laptop, and a database server should not all have identical baselines because they serve different purposes and face different types of exposure. Strong baseline scanning depends on that role awareness, since a secure condition for one asset type may be inappropriate or insufficient for another. That is why mature organizations usually maintain separate baseline standards for different classes of systems rather than pretending that one universal checklist can secure everything equally well. When analysts perform baseline scanning, they are essentially asking whether a system's current configuration matches its approved reference state closely enough to be trusted. That comparison can include operating system settings, user and group membership, security policy values, service states, software installation patterns, account lockout rules, encryption settings, logging configuration, firewall posture, browser or application controls, and many other elements depending on the technology involved. The important idea for a beginner is that baseline scanning looks for deviation. A deviation is any meaningful difference between the approved expected state and the actual observed state. Some deviations may be harmless or justified, but others signal poor hardening, unmanaged change, or a gap in administrative discipline. By identifying those differences early, defenders can respond before an attacker takes advantage of them. This makes baseline scanning less about dramatic discovery and more about controlled prevention, which is often where the most valuable security work actually happens. One common misconception is that baseline scanning is only about technical perfection or checkbox compliance. In reality, a strong baseline is not meant to create an imaginary world where every possible setting is locked down as tightly as possible with no regard for how the business operates. If a baseline is unrealistic, too rigid, or detached from actual system use, administrators will ignore it, work around it, or create informal exceptions until the standard loses authority. A useful baseline is secure, but it is also practical and tied to the real mission of the system being protected. That means baseline scanning is not just a process for finding technical differences. It is also a way of measuring whether the organization's security expectations are being applied in a sustainable and consistent way. Good analysts understand that their job is not to produce the longest list of deviations possible. Their job is to identify meaningful gaps, explain why those gaps matter, and help the organization move toward a secure state that can actually be maintained. Another important point is that baseline scanning works best when it is connected to asset context. A weak setting on a highly exposed internet-facing system may deserve much more urgent attention than the same setting on an isolated lab machine with no sensitive data and limited access. Likewise, a deviation on a system that supports identity, payment processing, medical operations, or core business records may carry far greater consequence than a similar deviation on a low-value kiosk. This does not mean the low-value assets should be ignored, but it does mean defenders should interpret baseline scan results in light of business function, sensitivity, exposure, and dependency. Security teams that treat every baseline deviation as equally severe quickly overwhelm themselves and lose credibility with system owners. The better approach is to understand that a baseline scan produces raw findings, while analysis turns those findings into prioritized risk. That distinction matters because scanning alone does not solve anything. The real value comes from interpreting the results well enough to support intelligent remediation decisions. Security baseline scanning also plays a major role in detecting drift over time. Even when systems begin life in a strong approved state, they rarely stay there forever without oversight. Administrators install software for temporary troubleshooting, enable a service to support a special request, modify a local policy to work around an operational problem, or leave behind accounts and settings after a project changes direction. None of those actions may seem dangerous in the moment, but together they create gradual erosion of the original secure design. Baseline scanning helps reveal that erosion by showing where the system has moved away from the state it was supposed to maintain. This is one reason many organizations use baseline checks regularly rather than only during initial deployment or annual reviews. The scan becomes an early warning signal that operational reality is diverging from security intent. For analysts, that recurring comparison is valuable because it turns configuration security into something measurable and observable instead of something assumed. There is also a strong relationship between baseline scanning and change management. Every legitimate system change carries the possibility of creating an unintended security consequence, even when the change was made for a good reason. If a new application requires a firewall exception, if a troubleshooting task weakens a local control, or if a support team adds permissions that are broader than necessary, baseline scanning can help surface that impact after the change takes place. This does not mean all deviation is automatically wrong. Some differences are approved exceptions that reflect a real business need, and a mature environment should be able to document and justify those differences clearly. The important thing is that the change should be visible and intentional rather than hidden or accidental. Baseline scanning supports that discipline by making it harder for silent configuration drift to go unnoticed. In well-run environments, the scan results also help security teams distinguish between approved exception, operational oversight, and genuine unmanaged risk, which leads to far better conversations with system owners. A beginner should also understand that baseline scanning is useful for more than just servers and desktops. The same basic idea applies to network devices, cloud resources, applications, virtual machines, containers, and other technology components, as long as the organization has defined what a secure standard should look like for that asset type. A router can drift away from its approved secure configuration just as easily as a workstation can. A cloud storage setting can violate a baseline just as meaningfully as a local password rule can. An application server can accumulate insecure defaults over time, even if its software is fully patched. This broader view matters because modern environments are mixed and distributed, and security posture is shaped by many layers of configuration rather than by operating system settings alone. Once learners understand that a baseline is really an approved secure state, they can apply the concept much more broadly and see why baseline scanning remains relevant as technology changes. The quality of the baseline itself strongly affects the value of the scan. If the baseline is outdated, poorly maintained, overly generic, or disconnected from current business and technical reality, then the findings it produces may be noisy, misleading, or difficult to act on. Analysts may spend time chasing settings that no longer matter while missing newer exposures that the baseline never considered. That is why good security programs review and update their baselines as systems evolve, threats change, and organizational needs shift. A secure baseline is not supposed to be random tradition frozen in time. It is supposed to represent current defensive wisdom translated into an operational standard. For a CISA Plus learner, this is an important lesson because it shows that good scanning depends on good preparation. The scanner is only as useful as the reference it is measuring against, and if the reference is weak, the confidence in the results should be weak as well. Communication is another major part of effective baseline scanning, especially when findings must be acted on by administrators, managers, or asset owners who may not speak in purely technical terms. It is not enough for the analyst to say that a system deviates from baseline in 12 places and then leave the report on someone's desk. The real challenge is explaining which deviations matter most, why they matter, how they affect the organization's security posture, and whether they reflect isolated mistakes or broader patterns across similar assets. If a baseline scan shows that many systems share the same weak logging configuration, that may point to a process issue in system deployment rather than a one-off error. If only one critical server has drifted in a sensitive way, that may demand faster corrective action because the risk is concentrated and immediate. Clear communication helps transform baseline scanning from a technical exercise into a management tool. That matters because leadership rarely wants a configuration lecture, but they do need to understand whether the environment is staying within approved security boundaries. A mature security program eventually treats baseline scanning as part of normal hygiene rather than as a special event. The strongest value comes when secure standards are defined clearly, systems are built to those standards from the start, deviations are identified early, and exceptions are documented rather than hidden. In that kind of environment, baseline scanning reinforces accountability because everyone can see what the approved state is, how far a system has drifted, and which gaps still need attention. It also helps create a more stable environment overall, because consistency tends to improve troubleshooting, patch management, access control, and incident response. When systems are wildly different from one another, defenders spend more time rediscovering how each one works and less time improving security in a systematic way. Baseline scanning reduces that chaos by encouraging the organization to think in terms of secure patterns instead of one-off system behavior. That pattern mindset is a major part of defensive maturity and one of the quieter strengths behind effective cyber operations. The big takeaway is that security baseline scanning techniques are designed to answer a simple but powerful question. Does this system still match the secure condition the organization expects it to maintain? By comparing real configuration state to an approved baseline, defenders can detect drift, uncover weak settings, support consistent hardening, and reduce the chance that preventable misconfiguration becomes an easy path for attack. This kind of scanning is different from ordinary vulnerability detection because it focuses less on known software flaws and more on whether the system is operating inside the security boundaries it was meant to follow. That difference makes baseline scanning a core part of long-term defensive discipline, not just a technical side task. Once you understand the purpose behind it, the practice becomes much more than checking boxes. It becomes a practical way to turn security standards into visible evidence. And that makes it one of the most useful techniques for keeping an environment stable, consistent, and defensible over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.